Okay. Um, hello. I am your moderator. I'm Liz Bosarge. I work at the local library at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. And this is our panel on postcolonialism in genre fiction. My family is Muskogee Creek, which is not the traditional tribal family or tribal peoples for the area of Baltimore where I am now. So I'm going to give a tribal recognition for the land that I'm currently on. You may not be on that land yourself. You might be somewhere else in America. But this land that we're on here at Balticon is the traditional land of the Piscataway peoples, as well as formerly the Nanticokes and currently the Lumbees and some other urban indigenous populations. And let's go around and introduce ourselves.
I can go first. I'll hop in. I'm overly eager. My name is Micaiah Johnson. I wrote the book, The Space Between Worlds, and I am currently both student and writer living in Nashville, Tennessee. And it feels like with those prior things, that's basically my entire life. I'm quite boring beyond that now.
I'm JT Greathouse. I'm an author and educator coming to you from Spokane, Washington, which is the traditional home of the Salish people. I have my first novel, The Hand of the Sun King, is coming out from Galance this year in August. This is the ARC. I don't actually have the book yet, but that's what it will look like. Pretty exciting. I've also had short stories out in various places like Beneath Ceaseless Skies and stuff like that. I'm pretty excited for this conversation.
I guess I'll go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Louzon. I'm a freelance editor and translator. I started studying Spanish when I was in kindergarten and then ended up in college majoring in Spanish and minor with Latin American studies. I've traveled a bunch. I had my translation of the story, a South American fantasy story, Amnesia, was published in Constelación earlier this year. And I am acquiring editor at the Dread Machine, where we have a call for submissions that ends Monday night at 11:59 p.m. For stories with themes of community, which I think really ties into postcolonialism. There's a lot of opportunity there. And then also the theme of security and identity, again, also ties in there as well.
I think that leaves me. Was good. I'm James Mendez, Hodes. I live in the greater New York metropolitan area on traditional Lenape land. I am a writer, game designer, and cultural consultant working primarily in analog gaming, also a little bit of like video games and other media. You might know me from games like Scion or Seventh Sea or Thousand Arrows on the like writing and design side. On cultural consulting, I've worked on stuff like Magic the Gathering, Frosthaven, and like the Jackbox Party Pack, the party games. My biggest upcoming thing is there's going to be an Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra RPG, so I'm going to design that.
Well, speaking of indigenous stuff right there.
Yeah.
So should we, I think I'm going to start with maybe the hot question at the top. How do you define postcolonialism? And maybe we'll go in reverse order, not to put you on the spot. James?
So I'm starting. So postcolonial studies, I view postcolonialism very literally. Postcolonialism is starts with literally the study of how do we remove like oppressive colonialist and imperialist apparatus from its place in the real world, oppressing people and making lives worse. Postcolonialism and postcolonial studies now means a lot of things. It has a really broad meaning, and I hope that with this many panelists, we're going to go through like many of the like the subgenres of postcolonialism. But I always say that even if you're working in a secondary world, even if you're in a role-playing game or a video game, everything that you do in a postcolonialist mindset should connect back to how are we going to make this happen in the real world, and how are we going to deconstruct the colonial powers that are like around us. And it gets in your head, and there's post-colonial thinking that is also important to undo, but never forget that there's like real mechanisms out there, and that's what we're always fighting.
cannot remember if it was Monica.
It was Monica. Monica next.
Monica.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, you said it so eloquently, like it's hard to come after that. I approach it from the perspective, so I, as part of my undergrad degree, I looked at a lot of colonial Latin American history and documentation about the colonial period in that time frame in colonial Mexico, Argentina, in particular, in Paraguay, and and also the process of like colonialism beginning in Spain, and the like from the Spanish perspective as well. So I've just been very fascinated, like ever since I guess about college, in how colonization affects the people who are being displaced by the colonizers coming in, how that, and then how the impact of that has filtered down to present day, as people come to grips and try to grapple with and reclaim their heritage or reassert themselves and get their rights. And like to like it's just very sad. Like it makes me very sad that this was an issue, like in the first place. But I am really interested in how Latin American science fiction in particular has been presenting optimistic futures for Latin America and different parts of the Caribbean as well. So like I guess I'm coming from that angle, but it really is just like, to me, looking at colonialism, the effects of colonialism, and then trying to reshape the present and looking at the present, we're trying to reshape it in the future with what we know about the past, which appeals to the historian in me as well.
Yeah, those are both really solid descriptions. I come at the idea of postcolonialism from two different angles. The first is in my education, I studied history and philosophy with a focus on post-structuralism. And so I kind of learned about postcolonialism as one of many different post-structural sort of frameworks. And in that context, what it is it's looking at the world through a critical lens of thinking about what are the structures that exist because of the legacy of colonialism, and how can we almost deprogram our thinking about the world from those structures. So how can we get beyond the assumptions that we make because of the sort of legacy of colonialism? How can we kind of critically and authentically engage with the long-term harms that have been done to pretty much the entire world because of the legacy of colonialism? But also as an American, how can I kind of critically engage with my own political situation, both having grown up in a colonized country and also living in a country that is still one of the most active colonial powers essentially in the world. And how should that inform my politics, my understanding of my own identity, and things like that? And then the other side of it is as a fiction writer who's interested in those kinds of questions, and then trying to think about how do I kind of, like James was saying, create secondary worlds that can connect to those ideas or engage with them, and like try to do some of that work of interrogating the real world through a fictional lens.
I am so glad that I went first from the introduction, so now I can just steal from all of you to craft mine. I'm a youngest child, so I'm quite used to that kind of theft.
That's what's up.
Yeah, just a little bit from everyone. One thing I do want to just get out of the way is I think what's important, as James said, the definition of postcolonialism is so broad and it means something different to so many different fields, right? Anthropologist versus history versus, lit majors. But one thing that it doesn't mean, I think people who are sticklers for language and literalism see postcolonialism and they presuppose that it looks at a colonialism past or that has ended and is like a discrete time period. But one of the most important aspects of postcolonialism, I believe, to me, certainly, is to recognize that which still is and to recognize that which, like those effects that continue and how we are all still part of it. And so that's like one of the things is that brings that urgency. And JT, what I'm going to steal from you as I go, is also that idea that it is a way of seeing and a way of making visible, because that's truly what the post in it signifies. It's just that it was always colonialism, but now we're forcing a visibility upon it. We're forcing visibility to that hierarchy. It functions much more like the post in like post-humanism than in like post-war or something. And so like seeing that kind of, just that continuance, that forced reckoning with, And as a creative, for me, it's very much about what you were all saying, is that imagining other worlds and imagining, like, tracing real histories and deciding what stays, what remains, and when we're crafting something new and imaginative. And me, obviously, like, I feel like colonialism hangs very heavily over my book. There's just like a literal wall that's stretching out. I'm not a subtle writer. No one will ever accuse me of being that. And so for me, again, coming from both an American context and like a slave descendant context, there is this immediacy and yet this long lineage. And I think that's what post-colonialist brings us is, as Monica said, a history, but also a reckoning with that history and how we still see it and how we're not looking out of it, we're looking within, right? We're all part of it. We've all, as you said, James, we've all kind of imbibed this mindset, and it just makes us aware of that. And that kind of obviousness is its own action and its own kind of work. Sorry for the rant, I ranted.
That's so clever. That's so smart to add in. I forgot to mention, usually when we do land recognitions, we also talk, especially in Baltimore, about the hard work of enslaved peoples, because this is a slave state. Yes, that's so clever. The people who were forced along with colonialism, who didn't, they weren't taking part in the machine. They were part of the cogs forced into it. We have a question here asking about works set in early history or pre-colonial, or possibly current colonialism. Like, how do we feel about those? I think my answer to the question probably would have been something like, hey, this is definitely colonial and this is something else, but obviously the indigenous perspectives are different. What do you all think about pre-colonial literature, what that's like, and then how that is compared to contemporary post-colonial literature?
Okay, are we talking about literature that existed in pre-colonial times, or people writing contemporarily in the past of like a pre-colonial setting?
I think pre-colonial. When they say pre-colonial, I think they're saying something like, we have a book called New Fire. It's written in the native language. It's written for Native people, and the stories predate colonialism. So I think that is what they mean. If they want to clarify in the chat, they can.
Just figured out to look at the question, so I might have answered that myself. I'm the worst. I'm sorry.
Outside of America, there's some really good pre-colonial examples for like Igbo and Yoruba cultures who have like really rich literary cultures.
New works set in the past.
Okay.
New works. Oh goodness. Okay. Yes. Thoughts. I'm sure we could also probably expand into some other areas, but thoughts on this, and then we'll just put you on the spot since you didn't get to go. You went last time, so.
Because you guys haven't heard me ramble enough already. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. For one, like, that's why I wanted that kind of clarification point. Whereas if you're writing now and you're like presupposing a time absent of colonial influences, I think that the idea of making that world sounds incredibly difficult, and more power to you. I wish I could write like historical fiction and not like lose my mind over details. But the secondary thing is to still be aware that you are writing in a power dynamic. And so even if you don't want to recreate, like, there are things that you actively can leave behind in any world building. I myself, like, when I wanted to write my world, I didn't want homophobia to be a huge issue. I wanted them to be absent of that pressure. I did bring in capitalism. So it's like, you always choose what pressures you want to leave in and what pressures you want to leave out, but just be aware of like how you're treating those characters. Like, you can say that there are certain stereotypes that arise from colonialism, but if you reinvent those or something, you do that damage outside of a colonialist bubble, you are still writing to readers in the now. So for me, it's like, I don't think you're obligated to always write in a colonial context, but I do think you're obligated to write as a harm reduction with an awareness of your contemporary context, if that makes sense. So just that was incredibly non-specific and very broad and non-helpful. But for me, I feel like there are very few rules in fiction beyond, wanton hurt to the reader, right? Wanton violence to people who are maybe less powerful than you. But otherwise, I feel like you can do whatever you want in fiction. It's just think about like the context in which you're going to be read in as well.
That's something, I'm like editing stories for the Dread Machine. One of the things that we come across a fair bit is authors writing stories that don't necessarily think about how they could be re-traumatizing someone, or how they could be perpetuating stereotypes by they're just using race as it's like, oh, hey, well, we're going to say where they're using aliens as a substitute, so they don't have, they use that as an excuse not to address the issues that you need to in the modern day in order to Like if you want your story to do well or to have a wide readership, you need to be respectful of other cultures and where people are coming from, and get those sensitivity readers if you're not from one of those cultures yourselves.
I would kind of attack this from two directions. So the first, that's what I did with my explanation of postcolonialism. I guess that's my thing now. But the first is writing about history, and the tricky thing about that is, if you're relying on like the historical narrative and historical like the history as understood by most people in the United States, for example, or most people who live in a colonial power, your default assumptions about history will be shaped by the education that you received, which was probably state sponsored and shaped by the political interests of the colonial power that is educating you. I teach high school English, and this is something that I have to constantly navigate, is when I'm teaching my students and selecting books for us to read, I have to think about how do I balance out what we're reading so that we have like not just the standard canon. And that goes even doubly, I think more so for historical research, is you really want to make sure that you're looking into like, what do the people who actually are part of the culture that you're interested in writing about that might be pre-colonial have to say about their own past. Definitely do not rely on the sort of mainstream settler narrative of what happened or what the pre-colonial world was like, because they want to present it in a specific way, so to justify the things that they did to those people when they colonized them. The other thing is, for writing in a secondary world, I like what Micaiah said about you can choose what you want to work with, right? You don't have to have colonialism as a facet of your secondary world. But I think that one thing that's important to think about is, in the modern era, when we think about colonialism, we tend to be thinking about like the great, age of exploration or the age of settlement or whatever, where the European powers went all over and built colonies in the Americas and so on. But colonialism has been a thing for most of history. It's hard to find a time where there weren't different groups moving into each other's territories, waging war for the acquisition of land and resources, and in the process, either suppressing or integrating other cultures that they were at war with. And so if you're going to have conflict between different groups, there will be elements that reflect the sort of impacts of colonialism in your world. And so I think it behooves anybody who wants to write the kind of stuff I write, which is epic fantasy with lots of battles and like intercultural conflict and stuff like that, to be aware of how these things kind of filter through and trickle out and stuff like that. And there's a book that came out this year, The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick, that does that very well. I mean, it's very, very, like, it's not really about a pre-colonial situation. It's about a city that's been influenced by layers upon layers upon layers of different cultures. And there's like a contemporary conflict between one group that's not originally from there and another group that's not originally from there, but they both tell their own stories about why they're there and what's going on and stuff like that. And so like that can be very interesting and cool, even if you don't want to like make the entire point of your book to be about colonialism. It can add a lot of reality to a story.
I guess putting on my cultural consultant hat, the thing that I'd always warn people about is, even if you're trying to make something that's disconnected from colonialism, the way it's going to get interpreted by modern people who live in like colonial or imperial societies might not be what you intended. Moreover, yeah, you also might have your own ideas, biases, etc., coming from colonialist tropes that you might not even know about. Like a good example is if you're making fantasy. If you make a fantasy game or a video game or a novel or anything, and it's got orcs in it. So the way that you characterize orcs based on previous orcs that you've seen in fantasy or like Warhammer, like war games, anything like that, you might not be coming at that from like a colonialist mindset. Or maybe you want to depict orcs as like a colonizing power who are attacking humans as a colonized power, something like that. But if you're drawing inspiration from, say, J.R.R. Tolkien, the inventor of orcs, well, Tolkien intentionally created orcs as a caricature of Middle Eastern and Far Eastern peoples, which he went on record in letter number 210 explaining that orcs are essentially this caricature of like Mongol type people. So you might be drawing from Tolkien, who never says that in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. He's only explicit about it in the letters, but those colonial ideas about fear of a yellow peril still made it into his work. So there's this sort of like trickle down effect, like it's like a poison that gets sprayed on a crop, ending up in an eagle somewhere that you got to be watching out for.
Yeah, that's
to
how.
add
That's
on
a.
to what-
Oh,
oh, you go. Sorry.
No, you go. You go.
Okay. Next time it's you, I promise. But just to add on to what you were saying, James, there's also, because we are talking about science fiction, there's some of that wrapped into alien depictions and the kind of the Orientalist like backing about that, like the alien and how that has been used in the past. There's a really great book called, I want to say it's Alien Economy, that's tracing that exact work. I will try to remember and put in the chat or something. And also like dwarves, where it's like, you don't know that they're anti-Semitic. They were anti-Semitic, you reuse them, and then you fall into this cycle of anti-Semitism accidentally. And you're in your mind, I'm using these pre-established figures, but kind of going back to, I think what both Monica and JT said, like these have these histories that you may not even be aware of how that was already baked in to their DNA.
Yeah, and I think also knowing, I'm always kind of nervous about like using reinterpreting established fantasy concepts into a kind of more critical or post-colonial or post-structural or whatever story. The reason being is the kind of stuff you're talking about, James. There's all of these sort of resonances that already exist with those concepts that are very difficult to unpack, and they're very difficult for anybody to really like, unless you basically spend years doing very thorough research. It's very difficult to know all of the potential like bombs that you could be setting off on accident. So if you like, it's the kind of thing where it can be interesting to kind of reinterpret those things, but you can't control how your audience is going to understand it. And so you want to at least be able to say with a lot of confidence that you understand what you're doing, particularly when you're playing in this kind of fraught space.
Definitely.
We came really close to this. Does anyone want to talk about some of the, it's tangential, but Wizards of the Coast, was it last year or not too long ago, the owners of Dungeons and Dragons made some changes to the races, and it was somewhat controversial, particularly about orcs, and about making them a little more sensitive and a little less offensive. And also, I believe they finally discontinued the Oriental Adventures, which was very terrible.
So this is a huge topic, and I'm
it's right in your field, so this is
I know, but I'm trying to like
hired you, and this would not have happened.
No, I'm trying to like figure out which things I can say that aren't under NDA. Okay, so at the beginning, the last thing I did before quarantine started was I went out to Seattle to Wizards of the Coast, and I gave a presentation there, sponsored by the Wizards of Color special interest group, about exactly this, about colonialism and racial and religious dynamics in fantasy. And we talked through a lot of this stuff. But then also, even like outside of me, like I've written a bunch of articles on it, which are on my website, and they're really long. So if you want to take your entire weekend and read them, get comfortable. But so there's been a lot of people in the fan community who have been talking for a really long time about how there are all these entrenched tropes in Dungeons and Dragons, which, as much affection as people have for them, tend to lead to situations at the table which really remind us of racism. And it doesn't mean, the most insidious thing about that is, for example, we've talked a lot about how you can trip and fall into these racist tropes by accident. So there's been a lot of noise being made in like the Dungeons and Dragons player base and in other parts of tabletop role-playing games about what tropes can we remove from the game that both strengthen the game and reduce the chances of you having an awkward encounter at your table. So that's led to, for example, it used to be when you picked a race for your character, yet they're still called races. That may be on its way out also, but when you pick a race for your character, and race in this context doesn't mean like a human ethnicity, like the made up category that affects all our lives anyway, but it means like a orc or a dwarf or an elf or something like that. It would give you a bonus to one of your character's statistics, like strength or intelligence or charisma. So there were some, I'm just going to say species in the game, which were inherently smarter or more likable or more agile or something like that. And the problem with that isn't necessarily that it's realistic or unrealistic. It's that it tends to restrict and affect the way that players make their characters in such a way that if you meet a character who's of a certain species, you're going to assume that they're probably going to be better at certain jobs. And unfortunately, that's also an issue that a lot of us have to deal with in our job searches in real life. And we kind of would like a break from it when it's D&D time. So, for example, they made a change where you can now assign those ability scores any way you want, that's decoupled from your character's race. So now if you wanted to make a stereotypical dwarf, like in the old school, you could still make it, but you also have other options. And then there's a host of other changes that are also being made in terms of reframing and recharacterizing old characters. Like there was the Vistani human ethnicity that were a caricature of Romani people that are being changed. Then there was this series called Oriental Adventures, which happened when, I don't know, Gary Gygax discovered like wuxia fiction or wuxia fiction written by white people, which was just like, how to introduce racist Orientalist tropes into your game. And I'm not sure what the future is with that. They added a disclaimer to it, although they're still selling Oriental Adventures. But there's also been a great deal of really exciting work done by Asian creators on both official and unofficial D&D settings and media. So if you get like the new Ravenloft book, there's like Indian settings in there that are actually written by Indian people. And then there's people like Asians Represent the podcast, in fan spaces who are pushing for like better representation. So I think that I don't think we've seen the last of the settings and concepts in Oriental Adventures, but I have hope that when we see them next, they're going to be approached from a much more like internal and culturally rich perspective. And I have a feeling it's just going to be cooler in general also.
Exciting news. And also I had heard that they were discontinued. Maybe libraries should stop buying them.
I hope you're not buying them because, yeah, those books are old. Yeah.
I'm sorry, that was really niche. Does anyone want to add anything to the game? No. Okay.
Yes.
We have another thing on handling in-game content. That's another day. Well worth looking into, and that's definitely going to come up.
Yeah.
Someone else mentioned in the chat, not a question, about where is it? Oh, yes. How we handle the hyper-colonialism.
Oh my God.
Oof.
A man who even his racist friends told him to tone it down.
Right.
Like this is the guy where like Robert Howard, noted creator of like weird racial dynamics, was telling this guy like this might be a little much, man.
There's some things you can't say. I think the comment is about, yes, that. But there was that really great series Lovecraft, the television show, and also the book Lovecraft Country. And if anyone wanted to pipe in and talk about some of those things.
That is such an interesting decision. That is something that I was at first when I heard someone was making Lovecraft Country, and I'm like, oh God, like, can we not? And then it's like, oh, it's like Jordan Peele. And so I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Now I'm deeply interested. And just the aggressive, as opposed to like, I'm not going to do this. Instead, the aggressive identification, but kind of like, I'm not finished with the first season. I'm only several episodes in, but to kind of also put that as the front load, because in it, without spoilers, like kind of the villains are these very pale, very blonde creatures, and the protagonists are, you know, Black Americans. And so to have this kind of conflict where they're calling it Lovecraft Country on so many different levels, it very much is, I'm like, okay. So I would say that, like, as opposed to like, do we salvage it, do we not salvage it? I think it's very interesting to kind of, and I think it's fully okay to have the opinion, no name, like he that must not be named. We shouldn't have titled it that, all of these things. But there is something very interesting in the decision to use it as this teachable lesson and have an entire series on racism that doesn't say he never existed. It says it's the whole country. And so to kind of like do that work, which is really, really interesting, to instead hold a mirror to it so aggressively. What I think you cannot do is casually praise without context. I think that the only kind of wrong option is to then bring it in as something to be exemplified and like glorified and never contextualized, you know, in the same way that like plantations still stand as places people have their weddings versus something like a museum, you know. I think that's always going to be a mistake. I haven't seen enough. I see here like the race in Lovecraft Country is a little rough. I've only seen like the first couple episodes. I'm more interested in it as an idea, just like, wow, like also just like the balls, just be like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do this instead. And however, like ham-fisted way that they did that, I hadn't considered that as an option, but I do think that's a really interesting way. But all that is to say, I think the only wrong move is to like still allow space for him and never critique him, which I think is just an impossible decision to make right now. And I don't think it's a totally, I'm not gonna say like moral, immoral, but I would stop being your friend. That matters.
I ran into something like this when I was still editing the Journal of Science Fiction for the Museum of Science Fiction. One of the last essays that I was editing or like trying to work with the author, I was like, look, this essay about Lovecraft and his writing, it has potential, but you really need to address all the race issues in here, because you're coming off like you are very pro racism and very pro the way he treats this stuff. And like, you got potential, dude. And like, you've got a bright mind. I can tell that from your writing, but you need to work with me, and you need to be addressing these things and looking into some of this other theory and bringing that into your work in order for this paper to be even remotely acceptable for publication. And he was like, no, like, he was like, this is the way it's meant to be. And I was like, nope, we're not publishing that one.
That's a strong feeling. I know there have been some, other than Lovecraft Country, there was two graphic novel adaptations of some of his works where they did not do the spicy stories. Go Tanabe is a famous manga artist, and he did two different adaptations of his works. And it's interesting to see people of color take works that are incredibly offensive toward them and kind of reinterpret and twist them and project their own voice on them.
Yeah,
Call of Cthulhu is the most popular RPG in Japan. They love Cthulhu, and it's because of a lot of there's been a lot of really weird, interesting like anime and comic reinterpretations of Lovecraft that drove that.
I think the best example of what you're talking about, Liz, that comes to mind for me is Pjala Clark's Ballot of Black Tom, which was a novella that came out a few years ago, which takes one of the spicy stories, which is, I think it's the incident at Red Hook, which is very racist, and retells it from the perspective of a Black musician who just kind of gets like swept up in some stuff that's going on. But it reframes all of the events of the story and shows how actually, like, in this situation, the scary bad people are like the white guy who owns the hotel where all the bad stuff is happening. It's not like the people that Lovecraft was scared of, who are worthy of being afraid of, right? Or who we should be afraid of. But there are tons of people doing stuff like that. Cassandra Khaw has written a lot of cosmic horror. Premi Mohammed's two novels, I haven't read the second one, but Beneath the Rising came out last year, was extremely good. Like, I think that in terms of examples of people really kind of deconstructing and then reconstructing a genre that has really problematic elements in it and doing it extremely well and in ways that are super interesting is cosmic horror. You just kind of have to be looking for the examples of the people doing it who are doing it on purpose, like trying to make a point with what they're doing. Like Beneath the Rising is about race, but it's also about class. And it's basically about all of the, how like there's a great hierarchy of horror in the story. There's like freaky cosmic entities at the top, but there's also like white privilege is up there in the freaky cosmic horrors hierarchy. So and that's interesting to me. Like people who are that's a way of decolonizing a genre, is showing how it could actually connect to real world problems in a more profound way than it historically has.
I think that's an interesting thing to include, because I work in library services. So of course, decolonization is a huge part of like what we do with our shelves, and trying to decolonize a genre is really interesting, especially with problematic authors. Not just like Lovecraft is like the big one. People are like, oh, he's terrible. But you also have like, so like the beloved author, L. Frank Baum was a terrible person. And people still hold like the Wizard of Oz up in their dreams, and they make all these different versions. I'm excited to see some retaking of that reclamation there. Speaking of adventures, I think that was part of what we were talking about. Did anyone want to add anything about my least favorite genre, Westerns, or possibly adventures? Like, speaking of problematic authors, we have Edgar Rice Burroughs, don't forget him, and his beautiful books, which were incredibly influential.
Yeah. Well, like, I think that probably something that many people might be wondering right now is it okay to read and enjoy these things if they're offensive? And the answer is a resounding yes. Like, absolutely. Like, we're all enjoying this conversation, but we couldn't have it if we hadn't read, Joseph Conrad, Rudyard Kipling, et cetera, all these people from the past. There's books with like really messed up stuff with them. Uncle Tom's Cabin, that have had like really positive social effects, and that's weird and worth talking about. So absolutely, you can read all these people and enjoy them. Hopefully not just them, but
pop in here just a second, especially books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Edgar Rice Burroughs, because they're super duper dead and it's public domain, so the author's families don't do anything. They're not there's nothing they get from this terrible colonialism.
Yeah.
You want to read The Mystery of Edwin Drood, enjoy that interesting perspective by Dickens, and he gets nothing.
I'm sorry, were you done, James? I wasn't sure.
Oh yeah.
Okay, just on the topic of Westerns, what I think is really exciting, as somebody who is like from the desert, very much so, what is always and will always bother me about both actual Westerns and then like Western-like kind of every time any like space person goes to a desert planet, there is such erasure of how like the West actually looks, who actually makes up the West. It's extraordinary to see so many like Western narratives with like the one indigenous person and no like Mexicans whatsoever, when it's just like in what world? And so for me, like the big issue for me is like a replacement where it's just like a retelling of the West as accurate, which is, again, still Western, still like it's implicated in that history, but that awareness of that history, to rewrite the desert with like the Black and brown people who have kind of always been there, but who are kind of foreshadowed in lieu of like John Wayne on a horse, right? And so that's something that I think is like super important, particularly when we have like the myth of the cowboy and we have these like early appropriated figures that have now become like only understood as white culture, regardless of their origins. I think there's so much potential in Western kind of literature for a corrective. I will not be providing that corrective, but somebody should write like more like straight up Westerns doing that work, because I love reading them. I just feel like it's like there's like a time period issue. And as I said, I'm terrified of historical writing because it's quite a lot of work.
I think that's a fine place to add in reclamation, because there were in particular, like we have a lot of nonfiction stuff out there about like Black cowboys, but like not a lot of fiction stuff out there. And like they made up a decent amount of that. And you're absolutely right. If you walked into a town in the West, it would be a town primarily of brown people.
And I'm sorry I'm turning into a vampire as the day goes on. The lighting in my apartment is not ideal. This was not planned.
Place to reclaim things, because like as like the West emerged. It wasn't just like white people swooping in and taking over.
Yeah, it would be super fascinating to see people do with Westerns what people are doing with cosmic horror now. Because another thing is there is a lot of historical evidence that a lot of cowboys were also gay, which is not something that's in traditional Western stories. But you could totally, like, if you were to tell a Western today with awareness of some of this stuff, it could be extremely queer and extremely brown and extremely interesting.
I think it's worth noting that was a huge part of pulp culture. Like gay cowboys was like a huge part of like pulp literature. It was like the gay male equivalent of like the female sweater girls like in college. Like that was like the hot stuff right there. There used to be tons of them, but it was never mainstream.
I'd urge you all to again, gamers, follow the work of Chris Spivey, who did Harlem Unbound, Call of Cthulhu sourcebook, focusing on Black culture in the Harlem Renaissance. And then one of his next things is going to be Haunted West, which is going to do a similar thing in the Western space. So it's all about cowboys and rail workers and other people of color like living out in the West. So it's gonna be cool.
Excellent. I'm all for the reclamation of new identities like the Western genre and how people identify with it. Also, I'm not sure, it's not in written books yet, but I don't know if you've noticed in fashion, there's been like a reclamation of like the Western identity with people of color, particularly thanks to Lil Nas X, and the cowboy fashion is still popular with Native Americans. I never hopped on the hat trend, but it's very popular. So hopefully that'll splash onto the page out of real life.
Oh. Yeah, yes. we have a question over in Panelists that says, must we go from the author had bad ideas representative of his times to he was an awful person? That's a really great question.
I write about this. I said and I said he was an awful person. And I hope they're not responding to that. In particular, I see other things about Romani. It's important to contextualize them within their time. So like if an author, like the one I'm speaking of particularly, like lived through, I don't know, the massacre of Wounded Knee and lived near there and like intentionally saw some messed up stuff and most people were sympathetic, I don't think it's super mean to say they were awful. And I think we mentioned Lovecraft earlier, like even in that instance, you're like, the contemporaries were uncomfortable, but maybe it's not fair to paint a wide brush about everything.
I guess one thing that I always say is that so sometimes we're able to make that jump, or sometimes an author wrote things or was explicit about these things, about like their specific ideas about people, which may or may not have been products of their time. But I think the important thing to remember about someone is that at this point, when we talk about the impact of work, in a way, you're right. It doesn't actually matter whether that author was a bad person or not. That's like if you're a biographer, then that's like a great thing to look at. But when we talk about the impact of work, people with the best intentions can create things which are really, really harmful. And people with terrible intentions can create things which then get interpreted or reinterpreted in really, really positive ways. So yeah, I think that we don't necessarily have to make that jump. With some authors like Lovecraft, it's less of a jump than like a slight shift to the left. It doesn't necessarily matter, and it certainly doesn't mean you can't enjoy their stuff, as we mentioned before.
There are some authors that are worth discussing that maybe are less like, wow, that's really offensive. A particular one for today that has had a huge impact on fantasy would be J.K. Rowling and her feelings about the trans community and sometimes the gay community, and how like the fandom has basically just sort of divorced her from the books.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that in the same way that, like, again, as we said, you can always read whatever, and we're here because we have read them. Like, I'm a 19th century Americanist academically, so all I do is read racists, and it doesn't hurt them to say that they are bad people. And we can acknowledge that they're bad people because it holds everybody else to that higher standard of being. And again, when we say, oh, it was reflective of their time, the time you're envisioning is a time that was created for you, not a real time. So a lot of times when we revisit these time periods, like with Lovecraft, we discover that even their contemporaries were appalled. And that's a conversation that happens a lot around, in the American context, around slavery, where it's like, oh, these people didn't know they couldn't help it, it's their time. When in fact, we actually revisit the contemporaries and not the history given to us, we find that that was not a default, that was not even common, and it was quite contentious even then. It's just that the victors write the history that we then judge those people against. So I would say that never stop reading anybody for any other reason than you don't like them, but also you don't have to defend dead racists. You can read and also call them not bad people, and it just keeps that standard high for all of us living now, as opposed to getting in the habit of making excuses. I don't think anybody should be thrown away. I think knowledge is valuable. Context though. And I think wanting to prevent that kind of criticism of them betrays the actual context and is in fact more disloyal to their legacies.
And I would like to jump in here briefly to mention the importance of primary source documents. Like, it's really important, especially if you're going to write anything set in a historical time period. You need to read letters, read diary entries, read estates, read wills, like land grants. Like, you want to read stuff from the time period that you're going to be set in, so you can understand the dynamics socially, and also just like how people were perceived, because you can learn a lot from just art from that time frame and the stereotypes that are portrayed in art. It's important to like look at these things and consider and like just take that all under advisement when you're going to approach these topics, because yes, you can write about history in the past, but you want to know who you're defending, I think.
An informed opinion, that's what that is.
Yes.
I think we're getting close to time here. So did anyone have any wrap-up thoughts they wanted to include? I feel like we talked a lot and maybe I left JT out if you wanted to add something now. No? Okay. I know that last one was kind of a meaty one that we sort of draggled on a little bit. Worth talking about, I think, especially in light of some of our contemporary things like J.K. Rowling. Any last thoughts? We can start at the top. James, did you want to start?
Yep, no last thoughts.
Okay. And then of course we can always continue this on the Discord for any other questions, comments, or contact stuff.
Should we say like where people can find us if they want to
that would be
argue with us? Yeah, so I'm James Mendez Hodes. You can find me at jamesmendezhodes.com. I'm on Twitter at LulaVampiro, and I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/MNDZ. But yeah, Twitter's usually the quickest way to get to me. If you want to tell me I'm the real racist, Twitter's the most popular place for that to happen.
I'll go next. I'm on Twitter. My handle is at @molo_rights. I'll be in the Discord after this, and I also can be found through the Dread Machine since I'm editing there, and Quasar editing as well. Oh, and one last thought, sorry, that I wanted to say was for people looking for post-colonial stuff to read, highly recommend reading translations of work from Latin America and the Caribbean, because that is a growing translation market.
So you can find me on Twitter at Jeremy TEG. I tweet way too much. That's mainly where I am. I also have a website. If you search my name, it'll come up. And my last thought is everybody should read The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez, which is the most interesting post-colonial science fiction novel I have read in years. It's so good.
I am also on Twitter too much, arguing about usually this. And my Twitter handle is just my name with an underscore. So just at Micaiah_Johnson, which if you can spell that, you deserve to be able to get online and call me the actual racist. I would second that. The Vanished Birds is amazing. I saw that somebody dropped Saeed's name in the chat. And so that's Edward Saeed, definitely something to pursue. And the book that I was trying to remember was Alien Capital. I only had to look to my side. But yeah, this has been such a lively discussion.
Excellent, excellent. Not that anyone's looking for me, but I'm at the library here in the city, and Liz A. Bosarge on Twitter. Also, if you're looking for some short stories, Full Metal and Digiclear is excellent. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
We're now
Thank you.